It was a quiet Saturday morning in our suburban neighborhood, the kind where the sound of sprinklers and children playing usually filled the air. My wife decided to go for her usual walk around the block, dressed casually in jeans and a simple t-shirt. She carried her small concealed firearm in its holster, something she was legally permitted and trained to do. The grip of the gun was barely noticeable beneath her shirt, but in a community where gossip traveled faster than the wind, even the smallest detail caught attention. Enter Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of the Homeowners Association, who had long made it her mission to nitpick every rule, whether real or imagined. The moment she spotted my wife, her eyes narrowed like a hawk spotting prey. Her voice cut through the calm air as she shouted, "You can't walk around here armed. That's dangerous and against the rules." Neighbors poked their heads out from behind curtains, intrigued by the drama brewing. My wife, unbothered, explained calmly, "I'm licensed and within my rights. There's nothing illegal here." But Karen wasn't having it. She puffed up her chest, her voice rising with indignation. "Not in my neighborhood," she snapped, pulling out her phone like it was a weapon of her own. With exaggerated urgency, she dialed 911, describing the situation as if she had just uncovered a violent criminal in broad daylight. "Yes, officer, there's a woman walking around with a gun," she shrieked loud enough for every neighbor within earshot. My wife stood steady, her hands relaxed, her composure unshaken. She knew this wasn't about safety, it was about control, about Karen flexing her imagined authority. And as neighbors whispered and watched, the stage was set for something much bigger than Karen ever anticipated. Barely 40 seconds had passed since Karen's dramatic 911 call when two squad cars came screeching around the corner, lights flashing and sirens wailing. Tires squealed against the pavement as the officers jumped out, hands instinctively hovering near their holsters. The neighborhood, usually calm and sleepy, instantly transformed into a stage of tension and curiosity. Curtains fluttered, blinds tilted, and soon nearly every house on the block had an audience peering through the glass. Karen wasted no time making herself the center of attention. She ran into the street, waving her arms with exaggerated panic, pointing directly at my wife as though she had just captured a wanted outlaw. "There. That's her. She's walking around with a gun in broad daylight," she cried, her voice shrill and triumphant. She looked almost gleeful, convinced that the officers were moments away from tackling my wife to the ground and hauling her off in handcuffs. But my wife didn't flinch. Standing tall, calm, and composed, she placed her hands where the officers could see them. No panic, no anger, just controlled professionalism. She knew exactly how the situation looked and how quickly it could spiral if she made a wrong move. The senior officer, his jaw tight, cautiously approached, one hand resting near his weapon as he spoke firmly, "Ma'am, we need you to remain calm. Do you have identification?" Karen smirked, arms folded across her chest like a queen watching justice served. Neighbors whispered, some shaking their heads, others secretly siding with my wife but too afraid to speak against the HOA tyrant. For a brief moment, the atmosphere was thick with suspicion, authority, and unspoken fear. Everyone braced themselves, waiting for what they assumed would be an arrest, none realizing the truth was about to turn the entire scene upside down. The senior officer stood just a few feet away from my wife, his stance guarded but professional. He repeated his request, "Ma'am, I'll need to see your identification." The entire street was silent, everyone leaning forward as though waiting for the final act of a play. Even Karen, arms crossed and lips curled into a smug smile, was brimming with anticipation. She was so certain she'd finally won against the woman she had long despised for not bowing to HOA control. With calm precision, my wife reached into her purse. Every motion was deliberate, slow enough for the officers to feel at ease but confident enough to radiate authority. First, she pulled out her driver's license. Then, she revealed a small leather case, flipping it open with practiced ease. Inside gleamed a federal law enforcement badge, polished and unmistakable. The sun caught its surface, making it shine like a spotlight cutting through the tension. The officer's eyes widened in recognition. His entire demeanor changed in an instant. His hand dropped away from his holster, and he straightened his posture. "Ma'am," he said in a tone that carried both respect and relief, "you should have led with this." Karen's face twisted in confusion. She blinked rapidly, her smugness melting into disbelief. "What? No, she has a gun. She's dangerous," she stammered, but her words sounded weak now, hollow compared to the gleaming badge that carried more authority than any HOA bylaw ever could. The officer turned sharply toward Karen, his expression firm. "She's more than qualified to carry. She's trained at a level far beyond what you or I are, ma'am. She's law enforcement." The crowd gasped collectively. What was moments ago a scene of potential arrest had flipped into something entirely different: respect, authority, and truth revealed. The air shifted instantly, as though the entire neighborhood had taken a collective breath. The tension that once weighed heavy was replaced by stunned silence. The senior officer snapped to attention, his eyes sharp with respect. Without hesitation, he lifted his hand and gave my wife a crisp salute. His partner followed immediately, their postures straight and disciplined. The sound of boots clicking together echoed faintly against the pavement, a gesture that carried far more weight than any words could. Karen froze, her jaw slack, her arms dropping helplessly to her sides. The confidence she had worn so boldly just moments earlier drained from her face, leaving behind embarrassment and shock. She had expected victory. She thought her call would end with handcuffs and humiliation for my wife. Instead, the entire block was watching her defeat. Neighbors began to step outside, no longer hiding behind curtains and blinds. They whispered among themselves, some gasping at the sight of officers saluting someone they saw every day in plain clothes. One neighbor murmured, "She's law enforcement," while another added, "And Karen called the cops on her." The senior officer turned to the crowd, his voice steady but commanding. "This woman is federal law enforcement. She's licensed, trained, and trusted with responsibilities far greater than most of us will ever carry. She is no threat to this community. In fact, she is part of the reason communities like this stay safe." The weight of his words silenced even the boldest of murmurs. The truth was undeniable. My wife, who had stood quietly and calmly the entire time, now stood taller than ever. Not because she flaunted her authority, but because others finally recognized the strength, professionalism, and quiet dignity she carried every day. The squad cars pulled away slowly, leaving behind a quiet street that buzzed with unspoken thoughts. My wife stood composed, her badge and license tucked neatly back into her purse as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But for the neighbors who had witnessed it, the moment was unforgettable. They had seen officers salute a woman they had only known as the friendly neighbor who waved during evening walks. Now, they saw her in a completely different light, an authority figure, a protector, and someone who had earned their respect without ever demanding it. Karen, however, was not handling the humiliation well. Her face was flushed crimson, her lips pursed tight as she muttered about unfair treatment and rules being rules. But no one paid her any attention anymore. Her power, once fueled by fear and intimidation, evaporated in the face of truth. She turned on her heel and stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard that even the shutters rattled. Meanwhile, several neighbors cautiously approached my wife, their voices filled with curiosity and admiration. "We had no idea," one said softly. Another added, "Thank you for your service, and your patience with all of this." My wife, ever humble, simply smiled and replied, "I'm just your neighbor when I'm off duty. That's all I want to be here." That evening, word spread like wildfire. Everyone in the neighborhood seemed to know what had happened, how Karen had tried to use the police to humiliate someone, only to expose her own ignorance. But the image that stuck in everyone's mind wasn't Karen's tantrum, it was the moment when two officers saluted my wife in front of the entire block. For Karen, it marked the end of her reign of petty power. For my wife, it was just another day living with quiet strength, ready to serve when needed, but content to remain the calm force she always had been.